Lesson 1, Narration from the Imagination. Today we're going to begin exploring a new genre in Reading Workshop. And I am so excited to share this with you because it's rich, exciting text called fiction. And so how many of you like to use your imagination to think of wonderful, exciting new ideas? Fiction is amazing because it allows us to explore faraway lands, new worlds, and unique ideas with our imaginations. Writers of fiction use their imaginations to create entertaining stories for their readers. While there are so many different types of fiction, we are going to begin our study with the following types. We're going to look at realistic fiction, myths, and traditional literature, which consists of fairy tales, folk tales, fables, myths, tall tales, and legends. So what we're going to do is we're going to see a few more videos of really going in depth of what each one of these types of fiction that we're going to be studying in this unit.
Are going to be talking about genre. Genre is a French word that means type or kind. And in the library, we can have genre fiction and genre nonfiction. Today, we will be learning about a fictional genre called realistic fiction. Think about these words. Realistic is like real, and fiction are stories. So these are stories that could happen in real life. They seem true to life, but the stories come from the author's imagination. Here are some more characteristics of realistic fiction. The setting is of the world as we know it. You won't find any magical schools, but a school similar to the one you attend. The stories are believable. You can imagine yourself as a character in the story. Everyday modern language is used. Let's face it, you won't hear, "The lady doth protest too much," or "Golly gee willikers." The problems in the stories are the ones we encounter every day. They could deal with families, school, growing up in nature. And the characters solve their own problems. The characters are human. If there are magical creatures, ghosts or aliens, it's not realistic fiction. And there's talking cats and dogs, not here too. So let's look at a realistic fiction book. In A Week in the Woods by Andrew Clements, we have a boy going on a 5th grade field trip. Have you ever gone on one? But during this trip, he gets mad at his teacher and gets lost. Again, has this ever happened to you? Finally, using his brains, he figures out how to find his class. So remember, realistic fiction are stories that you can picture yourself in.
Hey guys! Welcome to this Mometrics video on myths, fables, legends, and fairy tales. A lot of you have probably grown up with your parents reading books or watching movies with you. Well, chances are most of what they read to you was a myth, fable, legend, or a fairy tale. Let's look at what makes something a myth, fable, legend, or a fairy tale. A myth is a story that was made up by people who wanted to explain how or why our world works, how it came to be, how we should treat others, why hurricanes happen, and so on. Myths are sort of like our ancient ancestors' versions of science. Myths explain how natural events occurred and are set in really ancient times, before history even began. These myths are generally passed on from parents to kids, and when those kids grow up to be parents, they would also tell their kids, and so on. The word myth actually comes from the Greek word mythos, meaning word of mouth. Myths were shared by groups of people all throughout the world and became a really big part of their community. Greek mythology is one of the most popular examples of this. Their myths generally centered around various gods and goddesses. Sometimes days were even set apart to have big celebrations because of these myths. Legends are stories that people made up as well. However, legends are about real-life people and what they did. Legends always have an important purpose, but the facts are a little exaggerated to make them more interesting and exciting. Generally, some of the facts are dramatically altered and the person the legend is about never really did what the story says. Now, a fable is also a story that is passed down. A fable's overall purpose is to teach a lesson. However, all the characters in a fable are things that can't normally talk. A fable is about animals, plants, or forces of nature that can talk and act like humans. Fairy tales are probably one of the most popular today. Fairy tales are specifically for kids and often have a lot to do with magic, like a fairy godmother, elves, or any supernatural character. Animals can also be characters in a fairy tale. Fairy tales always have good characters and evil characters. A lot of times, fairy tales begin by saying, "Once upon a time." So, let's do a quick review. Myths are stories that are passed down about how or why something came to be. Legends are designed to teach a lesson about a real person in history, with a few facts dramatically changed. Fables are stories that are passed down with a good lesson to be learned and are about animals, plants, or forces of nature that are human-like. Fairy tales are stories that are specifically for kids, involve magical characters, have good and evil characters, and generally start with "once upon a time." As you do your reading, practice. Try to find out what type of story it is.
Fables, folktales, and tall tales. What are they? How are they different? And what should you look for when you read them? Fables are brief stories with a moral at the end. The main characters are often animals which represent human qualities, like Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare, and the fox and the crow. Folk tales are old stories that have been told and retold from generation to generation. They have no identifiable author. They tend to revolve around universal themes and reveal cultural values. They also will probably communicate a moral or lesson. So what's the difference? Fables are short and feature animals, whereas folk tales started as oral traditions and feature people. Both of them will teach a moral. And then there were tall tales. The main character is a hero described as being extraordinary. His or her abilities are exaggerated in order to engage the reader in entertainment. So what do they all have in common? They're traditional stories. They highlight positive human qualities, and they reveal cultural values.
So what we're going to be doing when we come to school tomorrow is that we're going to be looking at different types of texts, and you're going to have to know, am I looking at a traditional literature text, a myth, or realistic fiction? And hopefully by listening to those videos that you just saw, you learned what each one of those were. So this is something that we're going to be able to create tomorrow in our reading notebooks, on what type of fiction it was, and what kind of clues from the text that you knew that was traditional literature, or that was a myth, or realistic fiction. So the story Jalapenos Bagels, this was an example of realistic fiction because it tells the story of how Pablo in a way that could actually happen in real life. This was a boy that had a big project to do, and he had to choose what country he wanted to represent, what food. So he did one on jalapenos bagels. He was trying to use his mother's background and her type of food and his father's background, and he mixed it together to make jalapenos bagels because it represented both his parents. This one, the gods and goddesses of Olympus, this would be considered a myth. The gods and goddesses, they all have special powers. They explain why things happen in life, like the nature and why certain people behave the way they do. So that would be a myth. And then we saw something which is an example of traditional literature, which is a folk tale, and it's based on the way of life of people or a place that has been told for a very long time. It's been passed down by generation to generation. And usually, you're learning a lesson from a folk tale. So here's one from one of our books called The Adventures of Spider. And the first one I'm going to read to you is How Spider Got a Thin Waist. Many dry seasons ago, before the oldest man in our village can remember, before the rain and the dry and the rain and the dry that one of us can talk about to his children, Spider was a very big person. He did not look as he looks today, with his fat head and his fat body and his thin waist in between. Of course, he had 2 eyes, 8 legs, and he lived in a web. But none of him was thin. He was big and round, and his waistline was very fat indeed. Today, he is very different, as you all know, and this is how it came to pass. One day, Spider was walking through the forest. It was early morning, and he noticed then. So right now I'm going to stop and highlight this area. This is really cool because it's telling us right away that the story we are about to read happened long ago, and it's been passed down for many years. So remember, like I said, what's been passed down from generation to generation? Folk tales, traditional literature. Another cool thing about folk tales is that the storyteller often talks directly to the audience. He is not a character in the story. He's just the storyteller, which is an example of traditional literature. So he came across an unusually pleasant smell. He wrinkled his nose and sniffed the wind. It was food! Goodness! He had almost forgotten. Today was the festival of the harvest. Every village in the big forest was preparing a feast. The women were cooking yams and cassava and chicken with peanut-flavored sauce. There would be fish and peppers and rice boiling in the great pots over the fires. Spider's heart jumped for joy. His mouth watered, his eyes sparkled, and he smiled brightly. Already he could taste the food on his tongue. Now, of course, Spider had not done any of the work to deserve such a feast, and no one had invited him to come and eat. Spider had planted yam or a potato. He had not planted rice, nor gone to the sea in a long boat to catch fish. For Spider did not like to work at all. All day he played in the sun or slept, and since it's not the custom to refuse food to anyone who comes to one's door, he could eat very well by simply visiting all his friends. In fact, he ate more than they did. Now, Spider was right in the middle of the forest, not far away where 2 villages. Spider stood just in the middle, and the 2 were the exactly same distances away. Today, each village would have a great feast. How lucky for me, thought Spider. But then he was puzzled. Since there were 2 dinners, he did not know which one he was going to go to. That is, he did not know which would have the most to eat. So Spider sat under a breadfruit tree and thought and thought and thought. At last he had an idea. He could go to them both. Of course, Spider was so pleased with this good idea that he did a little dance right there and then. But how could he know when the food was ready? He sat under the breadfruit tree again and thought and thought and thought. And then he had another idea. He did another little dance just because he was so brilliant, and then he did 2 things. First, he called his eldest son, Kuma. He took a long rope and tied one end around his waist, the other, and he gave to his son, take this rope to the village on the east, he said to Kuma. When the food is all ready, Give me the rope, a hard pull, and I will know it's time for me to come and eat. And so Kuma went to the east village and took the end of the rope with him. Then Spider called his youngest son, Kwaku. He took another long rope and tied it around his waist, just below the first one. Kwaku, take this rope to the village on the west, he said, and then the food is all cooked, pull very hard on it, and then I will come and have my fill. So Kwaku went to the west village, carrying the end of the rope with him. My friends, can you imagine what happened? I don't think so, so I'm going to tell you. The people in the east village and the people in the west village had their dinners at the exactly same time. So, of course, Kuma and Kwaku pulled on both of the ropes at the same time. Kuma to the east and Kwaku pulled to the west. The ropes got tighter and tighter. Poor, greedy Spider was caught in the middle. He could neither go east nor west, nor left nor right. Kuma and Kwaku could not understand why their father did not come, so they pulled harder all the time. And something was happening to Spider. The rope squeezed tighter and tighter, and his waist got thinner and thinner. Kuma and Kwaku waited until all the food was eaten. Then they came to look for their father. When they found him, he looked very different. His waistline was thinner than a needle. Spider never grew fat again. He stayed the same until today. He has a big head, a big body, and a tiny little waist in between. So over here, again, I'm highlighting this area because if you see, the storyteller, the author, he's speaking to us, the audience.
Happy reading.